I'll just say about them what Ethan Cohen said to me about the first hour of Fargo that he watched. Yeah, good.
Noah Hawley, thank you for doing this interview. I loved the most recent season of Fargo.
Oh, thank you.
She's a wolf in sheep's clothing, that one.
I am so sorry for biting you boys. It's just, if you knew the week I'm having.
So how does it work when you have the idea for a new Fargo season? Do you start to write something and then call FX, or what's the process?
Yeah, I want to have enough of an idea that we can have a long conversation about it. This year I really wanted to engage with the film Fargo, so I needed to really figure out, like, well, what's my game of telephone with the idea, you know, as a man hires two guys to kidnap his wife, right? And then Joel and Ethan made their version of that story, and I made this other version of that story where the man is not her current husband, it's the guy she escaped from, and so who are the two guys? And then you just follow that out.
The theme of the season is debt. What did you want to say about that through the lens of Fargo?
Well, I think the debt is this thing that we don't talk about and that everyone has, right? 90% of Americans carry some level of debt, and it comes with this morality attached to it, right? This idea that if you owe money, you're somehow less than, you're weaker than other people. You needed help, right?
Yeah.
There's something wrong with needing help, right? We have this long debt, student loan debt, takes 20 years to pay off. And so when you pay it off, you're a moral person. And if you don't pay it off, you're an immoral person. And so for 20 years, you're both, right? Because are you going to pay it off or not?
Yeah.
And that felt like a very Coen Brothers idea to me.
Yeah. Can you talk about setting the season in the more recent past than others? It opens up with Halloween 2019.
Yeah. This show is an exploration of America, and it's looking at the sort of struggle of decent people against cynicism, is how I would approach it. And I wanted to look at Minnesota Nice, right? The Minnesota Nice, which is this cultural idea birthed by the film Fargo, in which people of a particular region are so afraid of offending anyone that they bend over backwards to be nice. And as Joel said once, it's like people in polite societies don't know how to bend. They just break, right? And so it's smile, 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 handgun. right? And yet I was looking around in 2022 and I thought, well, no one's pretending to be nice anymore. That was a big part of it for me, is about making it contemporary, was to go, all right, well, how do we get back to civility and decency and grace and courtesy?
You know, I heard a man went into the hospital in St. Paul for a kidney transplant. He ended up with someone else's brain.
No way.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. That don't sound accurate.
Generally speaking, at what point in your process do you start thinking about casting? And then once you have an idea, do you start writing toward the actor?
Yeah, I mean, it's always after a script, because a character needs to be a character, right? And you've got to go all the way with the character. You got to go full Roy Tillman.
Yeah.
And then figure out who's Roy Tillman. If you go, well, it's John Hamm, in the beginning, you know, then you find yourself writing to John, which is not the exercise. You know, it's always, I'll have written one script or two scripts when we get into the casting, and then I'll have an idea, or I work with Rachel Tenner, my casting director, and I just want to get the vibe. I just want to talk to them and feel like, oh, did they feel right? Like Sam Spruill, who plays Old Munch, Jessie Buckley in the 4th season, you know what I mean? I was like, oh yeah, that's her.
I wanted to ask you also about just bringing contemporary politics into the show, and whether you were worried at all about bursting the show's fictional bubble and making it like a culture war thing.
You know, my hope was not to engage in politics with the show. My hope was to engage with civics, in a way, to engage with these communal issues that we're wrestling with, and to sort of say, we're in a polarized moment, people are at each other's throats, but are we just gonna Hatfield and McCoy this thing forever?
Yeah.
How are we gonna get past this moment? And that was the goal in that sort of last episode of trying to wrestle with, well, what's after that, right? There's gonna have to be some kind of truth and reconciliation, there's gonna have to be some kind of forgiveness, right? Isn't this the act of kindness that we owe to each other? It's like, you know, so I think that was the goal of it, was not to sort of yell about things. And I also think that, you know, Roy Tillman as a character, there's a large portion of America in which he is the protagonist of this season of television.
Oh my God.
Right?
Yes.
And so the question is not, let's not mock him, let's not turn him into a joke. Let's present him as he is, and then ask the audience, are you still with him? Are you still with him now? Mm-hmm. It's the Walter White thing, right? Of like, how far will you go with John, who's quite winning, right?
Yeah.
Very charming. But, you know, he takes that long walk to where Juno's being held, and in that moment he becomes something monstrous, right? And are you still with him?
Right. The inspirations for his character, basically a constitutional sheriff combined with Cliven Bundy. What did you and John Hamm talk about in terms of how he could find that character?
We talked about Tiger King America, right? And the idea that if this had been a constitutional sheriff in 1980, right, it would have been moral majority, it would have been a very different America. You know, you think about those sheriffs in No Country for Old Men.
Yeah.
Tommy Lee Jones and the other guy, and they're talking about girls with pink hair on our American streets and piercing, you know. Yeah. He would have been one of those guys. Red meat, whiskey, whatever it is, but it's not nipple rings.
Right.
Right? It's not sex trunk in the bedroom, you know.
It's not smoking pot.
Yeah, and it's not smoking pot. And there's something, if you look at the reality of America right now, there is this strange combination of hedonism and Christianity, in which, in order to remain Christian, you have to redefine what Christianity is to fit your behavior, right? And so that was the sort of idea, is to say, he's a paradox. He's saying one thing, and then the behavior seems to be at odds with it, and yet isn't that the whole conundrum? You know, you feel a bit like you're going insane talking about truth in the same breath as a lie, right?
I know you think I'm this kind of perfect woman, wife, mother. But you know, even I got a breaking point.
Juno Temple is most famous for playing Keeley on Ted Lasso, which is very different from Dot. What did you see in her that made you realize that she could play this kind of John Wick combined with MacGyver, combined with genuine Minnesota Nice?
She's very mischievous and very playful. And you know what I loved on Ted Lasso is, like, she was always protecting the other person in the scene. She had a moment where the one guy got the wrong message and he kissed her, and then rather than react in a negative way, she was still trying to protect his feelings, right? You have this woman who has a 12-year-old daughter and a husband, and she gets kidnapped, and then she goes home and pretends it never happened, and she knows these guys are coming for her again, and yet she allows her family to stay in that house, and she staples live wires to the window. And you know, with the wrong actor, you're calling Child Protective Services, right? She's the worst mother you've ever seen. And so she needs to be the fun mom, the mischievous mom, where it's like she's just turning it into, let's an adventure, you know, it's a fun project. And what I liked about that, she's teaching her daughter to be prepared, but she's not teaching her to be afraid.
Right. The two of them together, Juno Temple and John Hamm, that doesn't really happen until later in the season, but they're incredible together. Just their physicality, he's so huge and she's tiny. And what conversations did the three of you have about what those scenes should be like?
We had a lot of conversations about them, and then the violence when it occurred. You know, if you go back in the edit, you'll notice that he takes that long walk. He goes into that shed where she's being held, and we don't go in with them.
Yeah.
You know, and he does violence to her, and we know what's happening in that room, and I don't want to traumatize the audience by showing them something. They know what's happening. And then we do cut inside after that violence is over, and then it becomes a fight. And that I show you.
Right.
John was, you know, very protective of Juno, making sure that she was okay with things. She was sort of more traumatized by the idea that he had to be this person, you know what I mean?
Right.
Than she was worried about her own safety in a way. So that was very humbling to see these two actors who were really trying to protect each other. I think that transformation, he becomes this old school Bible-thumping preacher as he's swinging this chain and everything, and it's so horrific. And we tried to make it in the most humane way possible.
How did you find the Fargo tone when domestic violence is so central to this story?
Yeah, it was a challenge. I grew up in a household where my mother was a feminist writer in New York in the 70s, and she wrote the first Speak Out on Incest. She wrote a book about domestic violence. So, you know, I knew in dealing with the story that I really wanted to be sensitive to it, but not shy away from it at the same time. But the tone is tough, and there were moments where I realized, oh, we're not going to be able to do it this way. It's too awful. You know, having Juno committed by her mother, which just seemed like a Fargo twist, when you actually put it on its feet and do it, and this woman who's fought so hard to be free is being captured, like, it's awful.
Yes.
To watch, and that she's being silenced, all of it. And so I had to take a step back and kind of reconceive. And I did some reshooting, and I added this nature documentary voiceover about the tiger, you know what I mean, in order to bring us back to the tone.
The tiger, spelled Tiger, is one of the fiercest hunters on Earth. The tiger is most dangerous when cornered.
I always try to avoid creating fresh injury, traumatize an audience, or even the actors, you know what I mean? It's like people have had their experiences.
Right.
We dealt a lot with racism in the 4th season, and I did not want the show, in order to show the characters dealing with racism, I wanted to avoid racism as much as possible.
Experiencing it
Use
themselves.
the bare minimum that I needed.
Her mother-in-law is played by the great Jennifer Jason Leigh, who you introduce in the premiere, shooting a Christmas card in October
Yes.
with the automatic
With a literal
rifles for
gun.
the whole
Yeah,
family.
yes.
Very Lauren Boebert. What did you want us to think about Lorraine and her matriarchy?
You know, on some level, if you look at the game of telephone that I was playing with the movie, I sort of took the Harve Presnell father-in-law and turned it into the mother-in-law. But then I also wanted to play with this idea of strong women, right? Whether it was Jennifer's character or Richard Morjani's character or Juno, that you could look at all the characters and they could all plausibly be some kind of Republican.
Yes.
But we're not having a Democrat versus Republican conversation. We're saying, no, these people all have a certain sense of values or whatever, and it's on a spectrum there. And as she is the literal queen of debt, you can't talk about debt without talking about this weird, self-made American myth in which if you need help, you're somehow morally inferior. And that she was carrying this idea of who Juno was, you know, as a gold digger, as low rent, as a victim, to get to that moment where Rich's character says to her, have you ever heard your daughter-in-law complain that she's a victim of anything, right? It's like sometimes crime is done to people and they are victimized. That does not make them bad people, right? So it was very important that this evolution of Jennifer's character, that she go from someone who's kind of closed off to the experience of others. And then when she sees those photos of what Roy did to her daughter-in-law, you know, we talk about the Grinch and the heart growing 3 sizes that day, but really it was like, no, not on my watch. No one's going to treat a woman that way on my watch.
That's right.
In forgiveness of your debts to man, will you consume his lordship's sins to God?
I will.
Ula Mook, played by Sam Spruill. It's in the 3rd episode when there's a flashback to 1522 Wales, where we see him as the Sin Eater. It's not the first time that Fargo has engaged in the supernatural, but how did you conceive of this character?
Well, I had read this book on debt by Margaret Atwood, which was a series of lectures that she did, and in it she talked about sin eating, and I thought, oh, that's a really interesting idea. If you think about the things that people do to each other about money, that's a pretty terrible thing to say, for 2 coins and a meal, you go to hell and I go to heaven, right?
Yeah.
And so I like that idea, but it's not a modern idea of sin eating. And so I like the idea that Sam's character, he sold his soul, and as a result is sort of doomed to walk the earth. Because he sold his soul, there's no me, there's no I. He has no individual sense of himself anymore. And so he speaks the way that he speaks about a man this and,
Yes.
and all of it. And he tells the story about for 100 years he spoke to nobody. You know, he had to learn how to speak again. And, you know, it's a fascinating character to create with Sam. But we have a history on Fargo, and the Coens have a history as well of dealing with these sort of elemental figures and issues. And yes, there's a UFO and the man who wasn't there, and the lone biker of the apocalypse, and Anton Chigurh, and all these figures.
He seemed like a resonant of Anton Chigurh specifically.
Yeah, they're larger than life. And like Billy Bob's character in the first year, you think, well, maybe not this guy literally, but some version of this guy has always been blowing around the American landscape.
Richa Morjani, who plays Indira, such a wonderful character. Other than the immediate relief that she's ditched her deadbeat husband, Lars, what are we to make of her choice to go work for Lorraine?
I think it's about where you can do the most good and power. And I think that Lorraine's argument to her is sound. To say, not only look at what they make you wear, right, on the police force, but I'm talking about coming to work for me, being the boss of all these guys. You can look at it as selling out on some level, but on the other hand, I think it's a false narrative that, you know, you have to suffer in order to do good, or you can't be compensated for the good work that you do. I think that on some level that the FBI never would have shown up at the compound if she hadn't been there to make that happen.
Called the Orange Idiot.
Exactly, yeah.
What's her money going toward anyway?
I know. What good is it if I can't have somebody killed?
I wanted to ask you about some of the music selections. It opens to Yes, singing All Good People, and then there's YMCA when all the militia people are coming onto the Tillman Ranch, and then the slowed down, you mentioned Roy walking to the barn.
The Toxic,
the Toxic cover.
Yeah.
I'm addicted to you, don't you know that you're toxic?
Yeah, I mean, I have Lisa Hannigan, who's the singer. I was like, I want to do a cover of Toxic, but like a funeral dirge version of Toxic. I think that worked out great.
Did Whitfar have to die?
Lamorne was tremendous in the show, and it's one of those things that I wrestled with. I don't want to put it on anybody else. And I thought, well, we're saying it's a true story. And in the real world, the good guys don't always win and the bad guys don't always lose. And it's a tragedy with a happy ending. And it felt like it was the right thing to do in the story. And the goal was to make him heroic and leave him with his dignity. And the tragedy of it, of course, is that Roy got away in that moment. If you look back at how I played it leading into that moment, you know, the moment that Juno has a gun on John, the FBI shows up, I was like, we're never going to play that this is an action suspense sequence. We're going to play the tragedy, and we're going to do it now, because the moment that she doesn't finish him off, the audience knows without a doubt something bad is going to happen. So let's not pretend that that's not true. And I think that allowed us to make Lamorne's death tragic in a way where it's not a disposable death in the end of a TV show, but it's meaningful.
How did you get the idea for the flash forwards in the finale?
You're always wrestling with, where does the story end? The first season of Fargo, Martin Freeman fell into the ice and she gets the call and then the show's over. The second season, 15 minutes into the last hour, the action was over and we had 30-minute denouement to it. Season to season, it just depends. Here, you know, I designed this whole season with this idea that, you know, Sam Spruell's character and Juno collide in the first episode, and then in the 9th episode, he just happens to be there and sees her in the hole and he saves her, right? But that's not the end of it. And I thought about the scene in No Country for Old Men. Brolin's dead, the action's over, Kelly MacDonald comes home to her house, she's just buried her mother, and Chigurh is there, sitting there. And she's like, I knew this wasn't over, right? And he said, I promised your husband I would kill you. And she says, that doesn't make any sense. And he leaves that scene. And I thought, well, that's the moment that we want, is Monk shows up, and just when you thought it was over, it's not over. I imagine that I set off to write that scene with the idea that it was going to be one last, she's got to figure her way out of this suspense action thing. And then I just thought, what if she said to him, that's your scene. I'm not going to be in your scene. You're going to be in my scene.
Right.
And in my scene, we're halfway to dinner and it's a school night, right? And the moment that I did that, I thought, I don't know what this is, but I'm really excited to find out.
Enlisting him and making
wash your
biscuits,
hands and help. And then it ended at the dinner table with the biscuit and him telling the story about this despair and this trauma and all of this, and her saying, well, you can be forgiven for that and forgive yourself. And I thought, well, that's the healing. Maybe that's the way out of this polarized moment, is we're going to have to give each other a biscuit and move past it.
No, and debts should be forgiven sometimes.
Yeah, of course, of course. It's,
not collected upon,
just be a little kinder.
Right.
That's all we need.
There's also, in the scene before, the Lorraine-Roy showdown.
Yeah.
Did you have that idea for their finale face-off from the start?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't want to kill him off. On some level, that seemed too easy. Justice, the whole season was a lot about how justice should actually work. It's not just one man on a horse, right? It's a system of justice and consequences. But that doesn't mean that Lorraine Lyon can't sit down across from you in prison and say, it's about to get a lot worse for you.
Thank God. What did you learn about Fargo by setting it closer to the present?
If you don't want to do satire and you don't want to do farce, it becomes more complicated to be comic about the things you're struggling with in this moment, right? Because the moment that you're mocking people, you're losing audience. The whole point of the Fargo exercise for me is we're not mocking the people of the fictional Midwest. We're honoring them and their dignity. Now, there's idiots everywhere, right?
Sure.
But we're not projecting that. And I think that's what set Frances McDormand's character, that's what made her stand out, and that's my hope here as well. And I think in wrestling with the contemporary moment, I didn't want Fargo to choose sides, and I didn't want to choose sides. I just wanted to say, well, look, this is what I'm seeing. These are the people that I'm seeing, and let's play this out and see what decency leads to,
Okay, so we're winding down.
Yes.
Rapid fire.
All right.
Or whatever you want.
Whatever lightning round.
Okay, who do you think Dot would have voted for in 2020?
In 2020?
Yeah.
The Green Party. No. I think she would have voted for Biden.
In the flash forward scenes, according to the timeline, those would have been late 2020.
Right.
No one's masked. Did COVID happen in the Fargo world?
Yeah, don't logic police me.
Fair enough. People love to rank the seasons of Fargo.
Yes.
Do you have a ranking in your mind?
I went back for the first time in gearing up for season 5 and rewatched all the seasons. I'd never done it before. I mean, I spent so much time editing them, and
yeah.
It's, but I thought, well, let me see what I've accomplished and what this is, and I, at the end, I'll just say about them what Ethan Cohen said to me about the first hour of Fargo that he watched. Yeah, good. I'm very happy with all of them, and I think they have a collective power, and I love that you can watch them in any order. But I think they hold up for me.
You're doing the Alien prequel series for FX, which is premiering next year.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Horribly. No, it's going very well. It's certainly bigger than anything I've ever done, and yet the same rules apply. I remember seeing Denis Villeneuve say that he couldn't have made Dune unless he'd made all of his other movies, right? And I feel similarly, like everything that I've done to date has prepared me to do something on this scale. And having done experimental filmmaking with Legion and Lucy in the Sky, how to use the camera, different ways of creating feeling in an audience, using lighting, camera, whatever it is, like all of it's come together to prepare me to make a show that I'm hoping is going to blow your mind.
I know you can't talk about it much, but you've said it's set on Earth in the future.
Yeah.
So there are aliens on Earth.
Yes, you're going to see that thing that has only ever existed in space or on a prison world come to Earth.
Wow.
And that is a a portion of what the show is about.
Do you have an idea for another season of Fargo, since the Alien show is supposed to be an ongoing series?
Yeah, I'm starting to have thoughts about it. Again, there's so much that goes into it, it takes so long, and I always wrap a season thinking, well, that's got to be it, right? And then some period of time later, I'll wake up and go, oh, I could do that. I'm not at the, oh, I could do that stage yet, but I kind of see what I might like to play with about it. I didn't want to do a 5th season unless the response was going to be back and better than ever. And it has been, which has been great.
Sure was, yeah.
And then you always start to go, well, I don't want to mess that up, right? You know, I don't want everyone to go like, oh, we should have gone out on the high note. So you always have to like think about like,
right.
Well, this could be another great season of Fargo, but are people going to feel this deserves to exist, or are they going to go, you know, he should have left well enough alone? So for the first time, I guess I'm having those thoughts as well.
Interesting. You've published 6 novels.
Yeah.
When do you have time to write books?
So, someone once asked me if I could have any superpower, what would it be? And I would say the ability to make more hours in the day.
Right.
I tend to write books in periods of time in which I'm not filming something, or writing something, or editing something.
When's that?
So we had a pandemic.
Yes.
Right. We had a writer's strike, which allowed me to start an idea that I don't know when I would finish, but unfortunately it's global health event or major labor disruption is when I get to write.
Well, the xenomorphs are coming, so you'll have time.
There you go.
Noah Hawley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you.